triggering events can lead to strong emotional responses, and anger is often one of them. But how can you respond if someone you care about is being triggered and their anger is escalating? In this video, we'll dive into some effective techniques for dealing with anger when someone is triggered and help you provide the support they need. But before we get to those techniques, I want to talk about how in our society, our understanding of anger is often muddled and unclear. As someone who was married to a childhood abuse trauma survivor, especially during the trauma recovery process, I had to change my relationship with anger. I had to learn that, especially for those in childhood trauma recovery, the anger itself is not inherently problematic. Rather, it is how the anger is expressed and how we relate to that anger that determines its usefulness in our lives. There are 3 things that I've learned about anger that I wish I would have known a lot earlier in the childhood trauma recovery process. It really would have helped us to deal with the anger that was occurring in our relationship in a much better way. And the first thing that I want you to know about anger is that it's not bad. And in fact, if they're in childhood trauma recovery, the anger is actually necessary. In most cases, people who have experienced childhood trauma, they have kept their anger suppressed. And during the trauma recovery process, I had this understanding as a wife that as my husband would start to deal with what had happened to him, that the anger would actually lessen or go away. But what I found out is that that anger is absolutely something that needs to get out. It is necessary for them to heal, to feel the anger for what they lost, to feel and let out the anger towards those that took so much away from them, to those that hurt them. And it's really important for us as spouses to understand that we don't have to take the blame, or we don't have to be the ones that receive the anger, but we do need to understand that it is necessary, and we can help our husbands or spouses or partners put that anger towards where it belongs. The second thing I learned about anger is that intimate relationships are in itself very triggering, especially for those in childhood trauma recovery. And that can activate some very serious triggers and responses. And that is where often the anger can be the strongest. And it's really important for you to understand that just because of your close proximity to your husband, that you will end up being perceived as attacking or being condescending or having some disrespect. And these can be very triggering, even though you had no intention of your responses or the things that you were saying to be taken that way. But it's important for us to know that those triggers are happening and why they're happening, so that we can start to make them better in the future. The third thing that I learned about anger is that, especially those that have experienced trauma, they often see there's only 2 ways to deal with anger. And the first way is to shut it down. And the second way is to immediately react to it. And what we all need to realize, those that are supporting and those that have been in recovery, is that there is a third way. And that is that you can learn to work through it. This is where I think that I could have done a much better job in my marriage, is helping my husband realize that the anger is normal. It doesn't need to be shut down, and he doesn't necessarily need to react to it, but he does need to deal with it. So before I start getting to those techniques that you can use to start working with the anger in your relationship, I want to just tell you a little bit about my story. My story started 8 years ago when my husband was able to reveal to me a terrible history of childhood abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church. We were really struggling in our relationship with a vicious cycle of triggering and defensiveness and reacting that we just couldn't seem to get out of. And it was only when my husband was able to reveal this history that we really had some tangible things that we could work on. However, one of the things that we learned very quickly is that the trauma recovery process is not easy. And in fact, a lot of the behaviors and the cycles that we were in actually got worse before we got better. However, 8, almost 9 years later, my husband and I are still together. We have created new patterns in our relationship for dealing with those triggers, and we are in a much happier and healthier place as a relationship. And I am here today because I think our relationship made it for a reason. I think that if we can share our story and I can share with you all the research that I've done, the trials and errors that I have made, that hopefully you can get something out of this if you're in this situation. So let's talk. Let's talk about how you can respond and how you can create new patterns in your relationship when you experience anger. The slightest disagreement can trigger an excessive angry response in someone who is triggered. You can start to take this very personally as a spouse in this situation. It can seem like you just can't do anything right, or that your husband resents you in some way, and that it doesn't seem like there is anything that you can do to prevent the outbursts. And while it's true you cannot prevent the outbursts, what you can do is you can start to deal with them more effectively. Now that you know that the anger is necessary, it's important to take a pause. When you start to feel those angry emotions come to play, it's time to just pause, and you need to determine whether or not it's something that you did, or if you think that this is some sort of response to a trigger. If it is perfectly okay for you to tell your husband, hey, I know you're angry, you have every right to be angry, but if you continue to yell or express your anger to me or the kids, then I'm going to need to take a break and leave for a little while until you calm down. That piece is very hard, but it's also very necessary if you want to start creating new patterns in your relationship. When things have calmed down, I want you to not just ignore what happened or push it under the rug. When things have calmed down, I want you to have a discussion with your husband. Let him know that you care, but that you will not let yourself be a target for anger that you did not cause. Things that you can say: it wasn't fair, it never should have happened to you, you have every right to feel angry and resentful. And then this is when you can have a discussion with your husband to talk about working on solutions for ways that he can express his anger in other ways without suppressing them. You don't want him to suppress them. You want him to be able to get those out, but in healthier ways. In our relationship, my husband was in boxing. He did a boxing class, and that's where he was able to get out a lot of his frustrations. Taking a break and going for a walk or a run can be very therapeutic. Expressive music, going downstairs and yelling, or go to the garage. But those type of things will help that your husband put that anger where it belongs and start to create a healthier pattern with the anger without suppressing it or without reacting it in ways that will later be destructive. I'm hoping that you found this helpful, and if you did, I really want you to check out my website at www.daniellesebastian.com. I am dedicated towards creating a community of wives who are working through childhood trauma recovery with their spouse.